Hello, Asha. This is my first webinar. So I hope you can hear me. I still have music playing. You can tell it's my first webinar. So my plan is to wait like 3 minutes. Not expecting a ton of attendees because this is not like a sales pitch or anything remotely close to that. There's not even like a call to action. Basically, it's more of an observation, just a lot of conversations that I've been having with different nomadic friends, both quarantining domestically and those who chose to stay abroad through quarantine. And, we just have a lot of questions. There's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding of information. So I thought it could be helpful to just kind of like sit down and like actually gather all of the data points that we have and apply them to life as a digital nomad, as a remote worker, and to see what a potential path forward, or I guess it's almost like a potential path back to digital nomading, and yeah, kind of just get the conversation going, and for people to know that those of us going crazy at home are not alone. It's some crazy times we're living in, but it's all good. Things are going to get better. Things are already getting better. So I am learning how to do this. Let's see. Make sure people can hear me. Awesome. Okay, cool. So here we go. We're going to dive in. I'm assuming you guys can't see this stuff, which is good. I don't want to see it either though, so I'm going to drag it out of the way. Okay, so today's webinar is COVID-19, impact on digital nomads and remote work abroad, with the subtitle basically what a path back to remote work could look like. And as I mentioned, the whole motivation behind putting this together was like literally been lying in my bed, just like dreaming about the day when I get that email notification that like Portugal's open, like come surf, because summers in Lisbon have been a part of my life for a few years now as a digital nomad. And it's been like the light at the end of my tunnel. And I imagine that a lot of us nomads kind of have like our visions of like my summer spot and my fall spot, and I want to be here for this, water festival. And but there was no concrete like information as to like what that could look like. And I think that for a lot of us, the mindset was more, okay, other people might be scared to travel, but I'm not. So as soon as, this flight's available, I'm gone, I'm doing it. It turns out it's not that simple. And I'm really happy that I took the time to put this together because I actually learned a ton in the process. So let's dive in. COVID-19 impact on digital nomads and remote work. So let's start with the basics. So what is a digital nomad? So a digital nomad is a person who can maintain and sustain their lifestyle, livelihood, regardless of their physical location, permitting they have like their laptop and Wi-Fi or whatever telecommunication device they use to do their job or to generate money. So COVID-19, the impact on digital nomads and remote work abroad. It is bad. It's really bad. It's worse than I thought when I first began looking into this. And through this presentation, I'm going to talk about why that is, what are some future things we can expect, and how we can begin preparing ourselves for, um, the future of nomading, even if it's not going to be as immediate as we maybe hoped or thought that it could be. So let's just to kind of like paint a picture of how much shit has changed. I want to look at like what nomading was like before COVID. So for travel through Europe, holding a U.S. passport, 90 days visa free within the Schengen area, 90 days visa free Croatia, Cyprus, and let me start by saying I picked out predominantly like nomad hubs. Like maybe people are super duper baller and are like nomading in Copenhagen, but that's not quite my price range. So you notice some places are on the list. But yeah, so we're looking at Europe, 90-day visa free, 6 months visa free in the UK. When we look at Latin America, very similar, 90-day visa free, 30-day visa free, but take a bus over the border and come back and reset. Mexico, 180 days visa free. In Asia, similarly, a lot of freedom, right? So life before COVID, we really were living in almost like a borderless world. Like as cheesy as it sounds, like anyone with the right mindset really could be a global citizen with relatively, little barrier to entry. That's all changed. That has all changed with the outbreak of the coronavirus, and it's unlikely that we will ever get back to this level of international fluidity, like in anytime soon. So I'm going to say from the beginning, I'm going to be ruthlessly candid with you throughout this whole thing, because like it was the kind of like splash of water in the face or the cold wake up call that I needed. And so I'm going to kind of treat it the same for you all. So again, this is nomading pre-COVID. So the impact of COVID on travel. So if we're looking at kind of like high level numbers, the World Travel and Tourism Council projects a global loss of 75 million jobs and 2.1 trillion in revenue. So what I want to focus on here for a second is that number of lost jobs. And this is again is in travel and tourism. 75 million jobs, right? So it's 75 million people that no longer have jobs. Okay, so if you think about your life as a nomad, let's say you're living in Thailand on any given day, you wake up, you go to a coffee shop, there's a barista there that's going to make your coffee. You stop by the side of the road and like pick up some fresh mangoes. Maybe you, I don't know, hop on your motorbike and go see like a monastery, go see some sights or whatever. You got the lady that comes and cleans your Airbnb once a week. Like we don't actually think about all of the people that go into making our lives as digital nomads possible. And so when we look at this number of jobs lost in the travel and tourism, like of course, a lot of that's going to be like in hotels and airplanes and things like that. But it's also going to be like those the interstitial people. So I think it's really important to think about that, because sometimes when we look at least in the US, a lot of talk about bailouts, right? So getting money to these airlines so they can, keep operating and keep their staff. Getting money to these hotels so that they can keep operating and tourism can keep boosting the economy. But there are so many more people that fall outside of those buckets that were impacted by this coronavirus, and that will influence have influenced how we lived as digital nomads, and until they are put back in their jobs, will continue to influence our lives as digital nomads, were it the case that we were able to get back to that lifestyle. So I just thought that was really, I read that and it hit me. So I threw it in there. But on top of that, the impacts include, travel restrictions, an expected global recession, unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetimes, and emerging incidents of xenophobia. So we see it in a broad scale with Trump saying things like the China flu and ignorant shit like that. But you also see it on a more like survivalist level, right? So if you look at countries that already have had a history of, let's call them dynamic relationships with tourists, or foreigners coming and thinking that, I'm an American, your laws don't apply to me, or I'm from the UK and this is Hungary, I'm going to pee on this building because I want to. That happened one time when I was in Budapest. So it's a little personal bruise. But basically, we're seeing these, we'll call them like indigenous communities, or like, I don't know what's a better word for that. The natural citizens, of cities, becoming a little bit more skeptical of being around tourists, expecting tourists or foreigners to follow their rules, because even before coronavirus, that there was already an issue. It's love and hate, because like, obviously, tourism is such a huge part of the economy for many of these countries, but it doesn't change the fact that like Western tourists can be dicks. I mean, Eastern tourists can be dicks too. But now that it's not so much an issue of like, learn how to say excuse me on the sidewalk. Now it's like, you just coughed on me and, you may have infected me and my family. It's like the stakes are so much higher. So it's an extra level of kind of us versus them that we're seeing, both domestically and abroad. So if we're going to talk about the impact of COVID on tourism, domestically in the US, hotels are projecting revenue losses about 80%, air travel's down 96%, restaurant, restaurant income down 85.2%. It's important to note that flights are still helping people get across the US and the world for essential reasons. But there's no doubt that the reopening of international borders is going to be a slow process. Slow process. And I think it's slower than a lot of us have realized, because, at least here in the US, we kind of live in our 24-hour news cycle. So we get a lot of input of what's happening in our state or our counties, and like different regions of the country. But from a global standpoint, unless it's like, look how many people died in this country today. Like, there's not really this open dialogue around how different countries are planning or coping with what's happening now, and how they are continuing to progress forward. To be honest, my personal belief, I think America did, choose my words carefully here. I think our local governments did the best that they could with the resources that were available to them. But as a nation, when it comes to how our reaction time and our effectiveness at addressing the coronavirus, like, we did a pretty shit job for a country of our size, a country with our resources, a country with our intel. There's absolutely no reason that we should not be leading the world in, addressing this and being more proactive in a path forward. Not the case. And so I think that a lot of news and information about other countries that did do a good job, that were on top of things like from the jump, like looking at Portugal, looking at South Korea, they don't want to talk about it because it's embarrassing. Like, it's embarrassing that we've got these countries that is second, and not that Portugal or South Korea are not, first world countries. But even Colombia, you know, like when I left, all the rhetoric around like, how are you going to survive like this pandemic in Colombia? Colombia closed their borders within 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of like the first outbreaks. You know, forced quarantine, not like kind of sort of, if you'd like to maybe stay home. Your cops were out in the street arresting people who did not have their asses where they needed to be. Like there's so many examples of governments that really stepped up and are seeing the benefits of doing that, and our government did not do that. And so we're not really hearing about it because it makes us look bad. That's my theory, but moving on. So going back to this slide here, I kind of pointed out the impact of COVID and tourism, but it's important to note that like we are nomads, right? We're not tourists. So a lot of the statistics that we're seeing around how the travel and tourism industry has been impacted doesn't completely apply to us as nomads. So we have some things that are the same between nomads and tourists. So that's like the big ticket travel, like the plane ticket from your home in Albuquerque to wherever you're going. But a big difference between nomads and tourists, nomads are pretty flexible with the travel dates, right? So we can optimize our travel around what is the most financially convenient time to travel. So if we look ahead to, you know, what's projected to happen with flight schedules, you know, there's going to be a reduction in routes. So let's say a flight between New York and Lisbon used to happen, you know, 3 times a day, 7 days a week. We might see a future in which it's happening once a day, twice a week. As a nomad, you're like, okay, I guess I'm going to fly on Tuesday. Now, let's say you are an employee or someone that has a more rigid travel schedule. This might actually impact your ability to even take the trip, you know, if it doesn't correlate with the time that you have available to travel. On top of that, we're looking at housing. So as nomads are typically in Airbnbs, long-term rentals, villas, things like that. Tourists are staying in hotels. Again, that's a lot of people together in a tight space. COVID breeding grounds. So obviously, the impact and the psychology is going to be very different between a nomad and tourist here. We look at things like co-working. That's where we as nomads may have a little bit of a how do you say, handicap. So like not being like cafes, co-working, those are not essential places. So, you know, as a digital nomad, there'd be a lot more working from home, but that's no different than what we're doing here in America. Dining, you know, you have an apartment with a kitchen as a nomad, so you can cook your own meals, even if restaurants stay closed for longer. And things like the basic needs you can acquired abroad. So worrying about getting medication for just like little things. I know that in the US, there's a lot of conversation around a lot of health things not being treated out of fear of catching COVID by going to the emergency room. Not that I'm advocating like self-medication or anything like that, but the healthcare system in a lot of countries outside of the US do allow for like a bit more, I don't know, I'm going to call it autonomy, you know, like I have strep throat. I know I have strep throat. I can look in my mouth in the mirror and I see the white pockets. I've had strep throat before. Like I could just go on Rappi and order the medication for my strep throat in Colombia. In the US, I have to wait for a doctor to agree to see me, pay the doctor, tell me what I already know, get a prescription, go to the pharmacy, see, make sure that my insurance approves. Like, it's just such a mess. It's crazy. So my whole point here is to highlight that there is a difference between nomads and tourists. And so some of the industry impacts that we're seeing in travel and tourism are pretty unique to tourists, and hypothetically wouldn't have such a big impact on digital nomads, which may sound like positive news, but unfortunately it's not really an issue of logistics once you get to your travel destination. And that's kind of what we found. But one more thing I want to touch on is the impact of COVID on travel psychology. So this one statistic I thought was really interesting. Approximately 1/3 of travelers remain committed to postponing rather than canceling their scheduled travel for the months ahead. So I didn't really know. I thought this was an interesting statistic because I didn't really know how to take it. Right? It's like 1/3. It's like, okay, so not most people, but not no people, so the third of people that are still not completely shut off to the idea of travel. So it's like, okay, there's a silver lining here. But what was really interesting is the stats around the Americans, most significantly, um, the numbers on welcoming visitors to their communities. So what we see here is that 35% support welcoming visitors to their community and 35% oppose it. So it's actually the exact same number of people that are pro as are against this idea of welcoming visitors into their communities. But what's really interesting is the definition of community. So what we're seeing now in America is this idea, the concept of the in group, right? If we want to go back to like the psychological biases we learned back in the day, the in group and out group. It's a way in which we essentially emotionally protect ourselves. We find people that are like us, and by like clumping us together, it allows us to feel like we're part of something bigger, right? So in an ideal world, like the in group would be like all humans or like all life forms, but that's not really the reality. But with COVID, what we're finding is the in group has shrunk smaller than like ever before, right? So you saw or probably heard a lot about this in places like New York, where a lot of affluent people in New York have second homes. So when the outbreak got really bad in the city, a lot of people made the decision, I want to go to my house, in the Hamptons, or I want to go to my house in this other community. Well, the people who live in those second home communities year round said, like, nah, honey, we don't want your dirty New York germs coming and infecting us. So they actually petitioned to put legislature into place that said that second homeowners would be banned from entering technically their own communities due to like a fear of risk of exposure. So if we're seeing that domestically, where people are turning to their literal neighbors and saying, like, you're not enough of this community that we want you here. You can only imagine what that psychology would look like, having someone coming in from Italy, Spain, or anywhere in Asia, which is absurd, but that's a whole nother conversation. So I thought it was an important statistic, or it's important to not only look at the numbers when it comes to the impact of COVID on nomading, but the psychology, because it's huge, and it's going to play a big role in how things unfold moving forward. So when we're looking at the stats in the States, in the period after coronavirus, the question was asked, like, how are you going to approach getting back into travel? So 47.1% said, I'll get back in, but carefully. 41.7% said, I'll test the waters first, which to me is kind of the same as I'll get back in, but carefully. I guess that's one level below I'll get back in. It's like a high maybe. But 11.2% said, I'll jump right back in. And I believe that 11.2% is us, as the digital nomads, as the people who were already living a location-independent lifestyle, and understand that, pre-coronavirus, there were always risks of traveling abroad. Obviously, in the past, there wasn't a pandemic, but like maybe a tsunami, like maybe a hurricane, maybe like a government coup, who knows? But, having that relationship with risk is something that I think is ingrained in us as nomads. So it's interesting to see that 11.2% agree that they'll jump right back in, because that kind of, to me, is like, okay, at least it's not like 1%, because then I'd feel like a crazy person. But to know that there is indeed a chunk of us that are kind of like, chomping at the bit to get back out there is encouraging in terms of like what opportunities I believe will present themselves once we have the physical ability to go back abroad. So let's talk timelines. It's a crazy thing to try and understand because literally every day these things are changing, right? From the shelter in place to the stay at home orders to the quarantines, um, every milestone that we have comes with an asterisk of, and like it will be reevaluated on this day, right? So it's like stay at home order in place until April 16th, at which time we will reevaluate if it needs to be extended. Okay, we've reevaluated. It's going to be extended until May 20 something. Like at what time it will be reevaluated, and that's kind of been the cycle like everywhere in the world. We do have some like hardline or more substantiated timelines or dates that are pretty cool or significant. So May 18th was the tentative reopening of the US-Canadian border. That was pushed back, but a new date was proposed. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I will get to it later in the presentation. We're looking at July 15th, UK will possibly return to travel. It's really interesting to me. There's a lot of information on here, or a lot of like published stats around cruise lines, and they're like, Norwegian Cruise Line plans to relaunch cruises July 1st. I'm like, who cares? Who's trying to get on a cruise after all that? Like, I don't know. Maybe I will be eating my words when these dates come. But what really stuck out to me was this date, the September 30th. Right. So it says September 30th, we expect or start to see demand for business travel in the US. And that is something that I do not agree with. A lot of my peers who work domestically for large corporations, so for big banks, big institutions, have already received the official mandate that they will not physically be returning to their offices until the first week of September. So what is the likelihood that within 2 weeks of humans physically returning to their office space, that business travel is going to become essential again, especially like by September, everyone's going to be such Zoom ninjas? This doesn't make sense to me. And so as I started to look at this timeline, I began to realize that, what? Nothing on here matters, right? It's all speculation, because there is an infinite number of things that can happen between now and May 30th, and obviously everything in between that would just completely nullify everything on this screen. And I highlight that to say, as much as we'd like to have a timeline of like when things could get back to normal, I think one of my biggest takeaways in putting this presentation together and doing the research is like having to swallow the jagged pill that like we don't know and we're not going to know, and like having to just accept, like just accept that, like getting comfortable being uncomfortable and not knowing that, not knowing what the end looks like, because that's where we are right now. That's just the reality of it. So timeline and summation. The return to tourism, so starting with domestic and regional travel, is expected to return close to the end of June, beginning of July, for some destinations around the world. So that would be like us in like Canada and Mexico, or, travel between countries in Europe, things like that. But some destinations, many in Asia, Spain, Australia, are hinting that tourism will not even return this year. So the shit's real. So impact of COVID on travel as of May 20th. So the CDC discourages all unessential travel, but this doesn't mean you can't travel abroad. It just means that you shouldn't, according to them. If you do travel abroad, you will need to follow the corresponding self-quarantine rules for each country. That's kind of like a duh. Most nations, including Canada, impose a 14-day self-quarantine once you arrive. Some countries take it a step further where they force you to like physically quarantine in a space that's like guarded. Like I saw some crazy footage. I think Australia is an example of a country like this, where you essentially would be taken from the plane to one of like a couple of hotels that they've eminent domains, and they keep you quarantined there for 2 weeks, and at which time they would allow you to rejoin the general population. So it's pretty intense. But this is something that's really key to note. Being able to buy a ticket somewhere does not guarantee you entry to that country. I'm going to repeat that. Being able to buy a plane ticket somewhere does not guarantee you entry into that country. And that, I think, is one of the most common misconceptions. As I mentioned, I was super stoked about going to Portugal this summer and surfing. And when I got that email in my inbox, I was like, Portugal is accepting flights like the Monday after Easter. I'm like literally packing my wetsuit, I'm like looking at surf camps, like super stoked. Even if I'm the only person that learns from this webinar, saved me a lot of stress, because like in the back of my mind, that was like the thing that I was like, so looking forward to. And only in digging and diving deeper into this process did I learn that, ticket or not, the EU is not even allowing is not allowing foreigners in at least until June 15th, and that date's likely to be extended even further. So that was pretty brutal come to Jesus moment, but it's good to know, right? So when we look at the risk for nomads on travel post-COVID, so I looked at the statistics for the current stipulations for returning to the US. And right now, our entry requirements are 14 days of self-quarantine on re-entry. And as of May 15th, foreign nations or foreign nationals might be banned from entering if they've been in these countries within the last 14 days. So it's China, Iran, most European countries, the UK, and Ireland. And there's a funny thing about immigration, and that is there tends to be a lot of reciprocity. That means when one country says, US says, hey, Colombia, your citizens have to pay, $120 or to come into our country to apply for a visa. Colombia doesn't be cool, yours too. So that's relevant because as it stands, the US is like the #1 hotspot for COVID. So the fact that we are already putting forth that nationals from these hot zones are going to be banned from entering our country means that more than likely these same countries are going to have a reciprocal relationship with US citizens. So we will be on the other end of this list for many countries saying, if you've been to China, Iran, most European countries, the US, blah, 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 we don't want you here. So that's another important thing to keep in mind, because that is definitely going to influence the mobility of Americans seeking to explore other countries abroad, even non-hot zone countries, right? So countries that have personally not been terribly impacted by coronavirus, they're going to want to keep it that way. So they're not going to have any interest in Americans or anyone else from hot zones coming in and potentially bringing, the sickness, potentially bringing the disease into their country. So that's definitely going to influence our ability to return to life as normal as digital nomads. But I want to return back to this slide from earlier, because as I harped on it enough the first time, I'm going to bring it back. So we're looking at the statistic regarding welcoming visitors into the communities, but this particular study or poll was just done with Americans, right? So Americans, 35 support welcoming visitors, 35 oppose it. But it's no secret, like, Americans kind of have a history of not being most welcoming, one could say, some places. And other countries have a reputation of being incredibly welcoming. So I had to stop and ask myself, okay, how much credence should I give to these statistics when looking at how foreign communities would likely feel about welcoming foreigners into their homes. So how much credence? The answer is a lot. The majority of major countries have a primary emphasis on protecting their citizens, which makes total sense. So unfortunately, that means that much of the travel reopening phases are going to happen in channels or bubbles, two different terms that are kind of being thrown around. And that means that, like, whether it's by geography or by risk factor, it's likely that the ability to travel between different places are going to create these modules, these travel modules of like safe zones, right? And so again, it makes sense, but it's a little bit it's sad. It's sad, but it's good to know. So this slide's a little bit of a mess because I was still having conversations with my friends as I was putting this together. They're in different parts of the world, so obviously time zones have been a thing. But I was fortunate enough to at least get the answers to like 5 basic questions from all of them. My first question was, do you regret choosing to be quarantined abroad? And every single person I asked said that they were happy that they stayed wherever it was that they were. And I think, each person kind of had a little bit of a different reason of, why they chose to stay abroad, whether it was, didn't really have a place to go at home, or have older parents that didn't want to be a risk to. But the overwhelming response was that their countries did a better job of managing coronavirus than ours, like, to put it as simply as possible. And as a result, they're more likely to be able to resume life as normal, life as usual, than those of us who chose to come home and be quarantined back in the US. So if you're looking at, in Thailand and in Portugal, life's kind of returning to normal, like people are eating in restaurants, gyms are open, you can surf. Like dive shops are open. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the travel, a lot of the reopening is expected to happen in these bubbles and channels. So these are the bubbles and channels that I'm talking about that we are not going to be welcome in, right? So within Portugal, obviously their bubble would be the EU, and it's so there's two ideologies on how this could happen. Basically, Portugal did a really good job of managing the infection. Their neighbors, Spain, are one of the hardest hit countries, and they're not very far from Italy. So there's conversations around like, okay, Portugal did a good job, relatively low infection. Greece did a good job, okay, relatively low infection. So maybe people in Greece are going to allow Portuguese travelers and tourists to come and vice versa. So that's an example of like a channel. So these conversations are still ongoing, but it's a little bit more difficult in the EU because of them being the EU, having you can but you can't policies is a little bit uncharted territory. But I digress. My point is, I thought it was really interesting because I expected in these conversations that, being quarantined abroad was so tough and I miss my family, but it seems like, it was a viable option for a lot of people, and they're really happy they made that decision. So I thought it was worth mentioning that in this presentation, because who knows what the future holds. There's a lot of talk about another outbreak this year, next year, every year. And so I thought it was useful, having such a strong community of nomads for me personally to kind of share their stories and to have those data points so that in the future, when we think about things like this, really looking at, not just where it's the most logical to, call home during a crisis, but being able to look back at historical data and be like, okay, yes, America is America, or it's where my family is, but how have they demonstrated their ability to respond in a crisis before? Like that, before being now, and crisis being um, Corona. And in my opinion, I'm not impressed. And that's something that I will consider in the future should something like this happen again. So let's talk about some predicted trends. First and foremost, there's going to be a lot more domestic nomading because that's kind of all we got right now. And even now, I think a lot of states still have some pretty um, strongly encouraged, not quite, there's all these different terms like stay at home order, safer at home, whatever. Basically, it's advised to still try and stay as close to home as possible. That's fine. But as we look further out into 2020, into the summer, into the fall, I think so. The first trend, more domestic nomading. The second trend, global recession. So we looked at the slide earlier that talked about, the massive hit that travel and tourism have taken globally. Well, that's just travel and tourism. Like, I don't even know what body, if even one even exists, that can quantify how many jobs have been lost, globally. The global impact of, like, outside of travel, of just people who don't have jobs, people who can't pay their rent, people who can't pay their mortgages, who can't buy food. So we are blessed to be having a conversation about when can we travel abroad again, because there are people who are literally living day to day as a direct impact of COVID. So a global recession is going to manifest in many verticals of the future. To go from a somber note, there's going to be more flexibility of flight travel. So as we're already seeing, a lot of airlines are canceling like free changes, free cancellations, like just buy a ticket from us and you can use it anytime in the next 2 years, like crazy policies. Like the same airline that would make you pay like fucking $50 for being like 1 pound overweight are now like begging you to maybe potentially travel with them sometime in the next 5 years. It's quite a switch up, but that's something that could potentially work in our favor down the road. Additionally, travel incentives as countries seek to rebuild their economies. So you've maybe seen this article. I think it was Sicily in Italy is literally offering to pay half of your plane ticket and put you up in like a hotel for free. I should get the exact offer, but basically countries and cities for whom tourism is the majority of their economy are going to be going above and beyond to entice people to come back to their community. So there's going to be a lot of incentives to get us to travel again. So that's something that, silver lining. Another interesting and predicted trend is more opportunities to buy and invest in real estate abroad. So for those of us nomads who have been kind of back and forth or on the fence about, could I live abroad one day? Like maybe yes, no. Now's a really good time to start looking at some of the housing markets in those countries that have caught your eye. I mean, it will probably be at least a year before things can, translate into like a tangible purchase. But like the global housing market, specifically, I was speaking with a friend In Portugal, like in Lisbon, I think like prices are down 10, 15%. I wrote it down somewhere. You can DM me after this and I'll get you the exact statistic. But anyone who's ever been to Lisbon knows it's insane trying to get like even trying to get an Airbnb or a long-term rental. It's almost impossible. I mean, the prices are crazy. And now most of these Airbnb units, because there is no tourism, have been turned over into or made available for long-term rentals, or people who were relying on the Airbnb or rental income can no longer afford to keep these homes. So if you are someone with a lot of liquid capital, I imagine that same trend is happening in different countries around the world. So if you're looking at buying and investing in real estate in different countries, that's an opportunity that may emerge as a result of COVID. Additionally, we talked about the localized reopening of travel corridors. So obviously travel within Europe is probably going to open up before the EU starts allowing in foreigners. There's conversations around the UK and France having a special corridor relationship where people can travel between those two countries freely. And for us in North America, our borders with Canada and Mexico will likely open before we start allowing any other nationals into the U.S. And this was an interesting statistic. It probably won't be relevant for a little bit, but as we continue to be mindful, until a vaccine is created, COVID is going to be out there. And so more than likely, these social distancing and social safety practices are going to remain really important. So if you look at, those big landmarks those big bucket list landmarks like the Taj Mahal and Machu Picchu and seeing Cristo in Rio, can you imagine the queues for those are already insane. Now add 6 feet between each person. So that type of travel is likely going to be incredibly stressful once things really do start to open up again. And I thought it was interesting because it was just not something I considered, again, as a nomad versus a tourist, but I said, why not? Threw it in there. And so I want to talk about the impact of COVID by profession, high level. As I mentioned, liquid capital, cash is king, right? So for us entrepreneurs or financially independent nomads, we're going to be the best positioned to benefit from post-COVID travel policies because we don't know what's going to happen. But when the opportunities do emerge, global economies are going to be so hungry for people to come and spend money that if you have money to spend, they will welcome you with open arms once we get to this point with the opening of countries. In terms of freelancers, it's likely that freelancers will continue to feel a financial burden. A lot of businesses, again, hit really hard by coronavirus, had to furlough or lay off a bunch of their employees. So when it comes to their freelance help that were brought in to run certain projects or campaigns, it will probably be a while before that industry truly recovers because just getting their employees back and getting their base operations back to normal, it's going to be enough of a hurdle for most companies that next step of initiatives and projects are going to take some time getting back to. But I wouldn't call it a silver lining, but on the plus side, so many companies, I wish I probably should have thrown this stat in, but I didn't. You can Google it and find it yourself. They have the data of how many CEOs or what percentage of companies believe that their employees can do meaningful work while working remote, and the numbers are insane. It was I hate people who misquote statistics, so I'm not going to do that, but it was a very low number. It was a very low number of business owners that had confidence that their employees could work effectively from home or remote. Well, thanks to the coronavirus, they didn't have a choice. So the entire workforce was forced to go remote. So impact by profession of digital nomading is, once things return to normal, we will have so much more data on how well people were in fact able, or maybe for other people were not, able to, not only survive, but thrive working remote. So making that case for, to your boss, your supervisor of like, okay, hey, during coronavirus, I was working from home. I was crushing it. In fact, my output doubled. And so now I want to do the same thing, but from Puerto Escondido. So like, what's good? So another thing that we might see in terms of impact by profession is like this emergence of new nomads of in the context of employees who were once unable to work remote, now being able to make a compelling case to transition into that lifestyle. So I wanted to do just kind of like some high level, like where things stand right now with immigration by countries, more or less. So starting off with close to home, Canada. So yeah, it was supposed to be, I think the initial estimate was like May 17th or something. And it got pushed back. And this is another one of those open-ended borders. So may not open until June 21st. So I took that to mean that at the latest June 21st, but in reality, it may just be another reevaluation at June 21st or on June 21st. When we're looking at Mexico, so tourist hotspots are expected to begin reopening like June 1st, 2020. But again, Mexico as a country took a while to take the coronavirus threat seriously. So while we have these date estimates, there's a high probability that, Mexico and these different cities in Mexico still haven't seen their peak of infection. So just because this border is open, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a safe bet to travel there, but I think the information is still important to have. And then, so when we're looking at the Caribbean, some islands, including Jamaica, Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, they may start accepting international tourists on June 1st. Other islands are waiting until July 1st or later. So that's close to home. We're looking at Latin America. Argentina's on some next level. So commercial flights to, from, and within Argentina are banned through September 1st. So they are playing no games. So any summer plans to Argentina, not happening. Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru may reopen to international tourists at the end of May. But that's something, again, as is the common theme here, it will be reevaluated. So we don't really know, like the next milestone of evaluation is the end of May. Same with Colombia. The borders won't open until May 30th, but the nation's under countrywide quarantine until at least May 25th. So I thought it was important to include that because they seem quite intertwined, right? So if one happens, then the other happens. But if the countrywide quarantine is extended, it's unlikely they're going to open their borders. So kind of keeping an eye on both of those facts. Costa Rica, ban on foreign tourists is currently set to expire June 15th, but it could be extended, especially as we as Americans begin this process of I don't know what the term we're using, reopening, reintegrating, whatever. Within a month, we could be right back where we started in terms of our infection rate. And of course, that's going to impact how other countries, declare their immigration policies. So June 15th is the date to look at for Costa Rica, but again, don't get too excited. I wanted to highlight this. Nicaragua, their borders remain open, but local sources have reported that the government is like actively discouraging citizens, including like high-risk citizens, like health workers, cops, like airport staff, from wearing masks. Like they're like literally in denial about the coronavirus. So I wanted to highlight that because if you're like actually somewhere like cabin fever, like I will go anywhere, don't go to Nicaragua. It's likely a much more dangerous choice than staying where you are, because regardless of your, I don't know, regardless of your personal philosophies, coronavirus is a thing. So to have a mindset of like, oh, we could be a little bit less over the top with our precaution, then that's a whole nother conversation. But to deny that it's a problem and to actively encourage your citizens to not just take extra precaution, huge red flag. So Nicaragua is on the, in my opinion, a no-go list. But if you do, just know it's a high-risk area. And then most Latin American nations are essentially off limits to foreigners until further notice, meaning they haven't posted a date of when they expect to start allowing foreigners back into the country. When we're looking at Europe, for non-Europeans, the EU travel ban on foreigners was extended to June 15th, and it's expected to be extended further. So I'm kind of going to skip down to the bottom because this is what really matters. Generally speaking, summer travel to Europe for non-Europeans is seen as unlikely, as many phased EU reopenings aren't slated until midsummer. And those phased reopenings refer back to what I was talking about those travel bubbles and channels. So like countries allowing immigration to the countries around them, like not even all of the EU. So for us as Americans, again, it's very unlikely that we're going to be making it to Europe this summer. Sucks, I know, but that's what it is. And then we look at Asia. Asia's next level, and I'm kind of sad about it, but I get it. American expats in Thailand who didn't leave before the travel restrictions may be able to book flights as soon as late July, but that's to leave Thailand. And that's not coming back in. So I read that at first. I'm like, oh, I can go. Oh, no, I can't go to Thailand. Cambodia has not allowed Americans, Italians, Germans, Spaniards, and Frenchmen in the country since March 14th. So they literally just kicked it. Like, yeah, they want nothing to do with us. Indonesia has discussed potential plans to reopen as soon as October, but for now, no foreigners are allowed into the country, including Bali. I know that's a big nomad hotspot. As it stands, it's a no-go, but keep your eyes on it for October. And then the big dogs, China, Hong Kong, Macau, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, are not permitting tourists at this time. And I want to highlight this. Unlike other countries or other continents, most of Asia does not have a target reopening date for non-essential reasons. And this is really interesting and important to highlight because most of Asia is in the process of getting back to normal. So I know you've probably maybe seen some articles about like, new, flare-ups in some provinces in China or what have you. But for most of these countries, things are getting back to life as normal. Again, restaurants are open, gyms are open, kids are in school. Like you have to wear a mask in a restaurant, which is kind of weird because how do you eat? But I guess you wear it. That's a problem for someone else. But the fact that they are already seeing progression yet have no target reopening date really speaks to the mindset of the rest of the world of the eagerness with which they're approaching reopening their borders. So when we look back, or when we think back to that first slide about how easy it was just a few months ago for anyone with an American or a European passport to just kick it for like 3 months, like anywhere in the world, that's done. And for a lot of these countries, there is no rush to get back to that. And I think that is kind of like the thing that we need to sit with as nomads is that that's where we're at right now. And that's what it is. So brass tacks, high level. The greatest barrier to returning to nomad life is the logistics of border reopening. For like top nomad hubs, that could range anywhere from early June, unlikely, but possibly, to sometime in 2021. Because of how the phase reopening works, by the time borders are open to non-essential travel, like nomading, the infrastructure will likely be ready to once again support digital nomads. So that's kind of cool. Like basically, once we can physically go somewhere, it's likely that like the cafes and the co-working and the gyms and the things that we depend on as digital nomads will also be available. So at least there won't kind of be this like ramping up of like, okay, we can technically go, but like, there's nowhere to eat, or there's no, it will likely be the last piece of the puzzle. Additionally, the biggest asset that nomads will have is our greater comfort in general travel, and thus returning to travel over the average tourist. So again, going back to that flexibility of like, because things are changing every day, like, I don't know, this is like not scientifically possible, I don't believe. But let's say a vaccine's like created tomorrow and they're like, okay, all the borders are open, like everyone can start traveling, like starting Monday. I think us as seasoned digital nomads or remote workers will have an advantage in the psychological aspect of getting back to travel and getting back to our global communities that we so dearly miss. And kind of like in summation, now is really the time to focus on building yourself and your business, building out your assets so that when the borders do reopen, you're ready to go, both financially and emotionally, because we all took many, many emotional hits during this time, and I don't think they're going to stop anytime soon. So really using this time to, instead of like daydream about the future, accept like where we're at right now, and like use this time to just be building and hustling and just like really doubling down on your vision of like where you want to be. So when the opportunities present themselves, like you are able to receive them, if that makes sense. So just like to be, I don't know, why not? Where we're looking in 2020, as you can see, everything's in Mexico or Canada. And so Puerto Escondido, huge nomad hub, especially if you like to surf. Playa del Carmen, Mexico City, again, two huge nomad hubs, very affordable. Like they have the infrastructure to support nomads, but it's important to keep an eye on the infection rate and what's happening in Mexico, because they have demonstrated a certain lack of aggression when it comes to treating or addressing COVID and coronavirus. So keep that in mind. When we look up to our neighbors in the north, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Winnipeg are also three great places to consider as digital nomads. Lots of co-working places, which are not open yet. But again, this is looking forward in 2020. And then lastly, as I mentioned, I think in the first or one of the first slides, is like RV, van life, just domestic nomading. I don't know about you guys. I've never been to a national park, at least not on purpose. So this might be the time, where, going out west, kind of like those things that, I don't know, I've never seen Niagara Falls, kind of like taking a time to find the silver lining of like, okay, so if I'm stuck in North America, how do I turn this into a plus? So that's another possibility for 2020. But beyond that, for us as Americans, it's unlikely that we will get back to the way things were as digital, not even the way things were, that we will be able to move freely as digital nomads anytime in the rest of this year in 2020. And I know that sucks. I think maybe some of you are hoping this webinar is going to have like a happy ending, like, oh, September, like party in, I don't know, France. That's not going to be the case. And I think it's more helpful to kind of accept that and to look at ways that we can, as I mentioned before, really focus on being like future minded, but present and in the moment of like, where am I? How do I turn what's happening right now into like the foundation for where I want to be? And I think that's the major key. So yeah, that's it. It was longer than I intended for it to be, and I do apologize for that. Um, do you have any questions for me, Asha? Probably not. I just word vomited a whole bunch there. As I mentioned, this webinar was really just to kind of consolidate a lot of information that uh, a lot of information that I've been getting, and kind of consolidate it in a way that's relevant for us as digital nomads. So there's no upsell, there's no, take my course and learn how to be a digital nomad in 2021. I just thought it was an important conversation to have, and I wanted to have it with anyone who's interested in listening to it. So if you have any additional questions or thoughts or ideas or want to continue or the conversation further, I hope you'll reach out to me on any form of social media, Instagram or Facebook. My Instagram handle is @TaylorWallace. That's me. Um, and yeah, I guess like stay strong out there, guys, and just keep learning and challenging yourselves, and like we'll get through this together. Eventually we will be able to go back abroad and like just think about how much more like exciting and how much more you'll appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I'm like having a flashback to living in Medellin and like spending an entire day in bed watching Netflix while like this beautiful city is outside my window, and now I'm just like ashamed of myself. Not ashamed, but I think that we'll all come out of this stronger and ready for like this next chapter of understanding what it means to be globally minded and members of a global community once we get there. So that's it. That's all I've got for you. Thanks for tuning in and making time to hear me, see me, and I hope you got something out of this, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. All right, guys, keep fighting the good fight. Cheers.